Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, Book 5. Chapter 1. In a world controlled by God, nothing is left to chance. So Aristotle's definition of chance is that whenever something is done for some particular purpose and something else occurs different from what was intended or expected, it is called chance. So Boethius gives the example of someone who's digging in the field, maybe to prepare the field for planting a crop, and he finds gold buried in the field. The reason that he was digging in the field was not to find the gold, but was to plant crops. And by chance, he found the gold in the field because he was digging for one purpose and something else occurred. And so that's what Aristotle would term as chance. But he says in the chapter, if God controls all things in his ordering, what room is left for the operation of chance? It is an obvious truth that nothing comes from nothing. So if God controls everything, does it really make sense that just random chance would occur? Neither the man who hid the gold nor the man digging in the field intended that the gold should be found, but there was a coincidence in that one man happened to be digging where the other had hidden his treasure. We can define chance, then, as the unexpected result of causes that come together of things that were done for some other purpose. Now, the confluence of these causes and their connection derives from providence, which disposes of all things in their appropriate times and places. And then he ends that chapter with a poem about how the path of that a river flows is not by chance, that it's determined by God. Chapter 2. Free will. Rational beings must possess free will, or the freedom to make choices. A man uses his judgment to determine what things are good or bad, what is to be sought, and what is to be avoided. The more spiritual a creature is, the clearer and the freer are its judgments. And the more corporeal or earthly or body-centered the creature is, the less free they are, and the less clear their judgments are. So this can apply to, you could think of, like, for instance, angels and God being the most spiritual creatures, and lower animals as being more corporeal and body-centered, and man being kind of in the middle between being corporeal and being spiritual. So men have free will, but are more or less free based on how they use that freedom, because you can become a slave to sin. If you get in the habit of committing a certain sin, it's hard to get out of that habit, and your free will is less effective in stopping you from doing it, even though you know it might be wrong or that it's causing you problems. But then he concludes by saying, but God looks after them and gives rewards and punishments according to what they deserve. So, in the end, God looks at the choices that people make with their free will, and he rewards them or punishes them accordingly. And he does that in eternity, right? So in heaven or in hell. And sometimes also in temporal, in time, he also sometimes punishes or rewards people also. He ends that chapter with a poem about how Phoebus's light, Phoebus is the mythological figure that carries the sun across the sky in his chariot, how Phoebus's light does not pierce the depths of the earth, but God sees all things. So in chapter 3, Boethius brings up the question of how is there free will if God knows everything that will happen in advance? So in chapter 1, we talked about how God controls the world, nothing is left to chance. But at the same time, in chapter 2, we talked about how humans have free will, so that they can make either good or bad choices and are rewarded for them or punished for them. So then the question is, how do those two things reconcile? How is there free will if God knows everything that will happen in advance and if he controls everything? So since what God knows in advance must necessarily happen, it would seem that there would be no free will, since God would be controlling it. Some argue that things don't happen because God foresees it, but he foresees it because they will happen. But this is kind of a circular argument, right? It seems like we're just kind of changing things around. So what is the cause? Do things happen because God foresees them? Or does God simply foresee what is coming because they are going to happen, but they don't need to? So this idea of predestination is reminiscent of the story of Oedipus Rex from Greek mythology, the man who killed his father and married his mother through fate. Briefly, the story goes that Oedipus was when he was born, it was prophesied that he would kill his father and marry his mother, and so his parents had him adopted out to another family far away, to people that lived in a totally different city than them, so that he would live in a totally different place and the prophecy could never come true. When Oedipus is older, he doesn't know that he was adopted out. He thinks that he lives with his true parents. He is traveling and he meets a sphinx who prophesies to him that he will kill his father and marries his mother. He's of course horrified and decides that he is going to leave his home forever and never see his parents again. Of course, they're not his true parents, they're his adopted parents. Along the way on the road, while he's traveling, he meets his real father, who he doesn't know and has never met. And they have a big disagreement with each other and get in a fight, and Oedipus kills him, not realizing it's his father. He then goes to the city where his father was king, and the people don't realize what he's done to their king, but they do realize that their king has been killed, and they decide to make Oedipus king. And as part of that, he has to marry the old queen, which, unbeknownst to him, is his mother. And so through fate, he is made to do something that is abhorrent to him, even though he didn't even realize he was doing it. So this is the idea of fate or predestination in the pagan world. And so this is kind of what they're asking about here. Do things happen because, so if God foresees something, does it have to happen? Is it like no matter what somebody does? Like, for instance, if God foresees that somebody is going to hell, does that mean they're going to hell for sure and there's nothing they can do about it? And of course the answer is no, right? But he's going to spend the rest of the chapter explaining why that's not the case. So because God is in eternity, not in time, he views all of time as happening at once. And this is the nature of his foreknowledge. If we did believe that that because of God's foreknowledge or predestination that people were destined either for heaven or hell and there's nothing they could do about it, or that bad things were going to happen to people regardless of what they did and things like that, then this would seem to do away with the freedom of the individual, and this way of thinking would make nonsense of heaven and hell, since people didn't even have a choice to do what they did or to go where they were going to go, but they must do what God foresees. And it wouldn't make any sense to be punishing them for it or rewarding it for them if it was just something that they had to do anyway. It would also make nonsense out of praying, right? It wouldn't make any sense to pray to God for any different results because God would not be able to change his preordained will. He had already decided what he was going to do, so any prayers you would make would be a waste of time at that point. So obviously this is not the case, but this shows you why that can't be the case. And then there's a poem at the end of the end of chapter 3 about how difficult it is to understand the mind of God. Chapter 4 is about the foreknowledge of God, in other words, the fact that he knows things ahead of time before they happen, versus predestination, which would be the idea that they have to happen that way because God foresees them. Let us say that God has foreknowledge of events, but it doesn't impose predestination. In other words, he knows what's going to happen, but they don't have to happen that way because they could happen either way. In that case, the freedom of the will would remain absolute. It is impossible that what is foreseen would fail to happen. This would mean that things that God could foretell, if things that God could foretell did not happen, it would make him less than omniscient or all-knowing. So if God was to foresee that something was to happen a certain way and it didn't happen that way, that would show that he actually didn't know all things in the future, right? So foreknowledge is not the same as fate. Fate is more like the idea of what we saw in Oedipus Rex, where it was foretold this is what was going to happen, and he was doomed to have that happen no matter how hard he tried not to make it happen. But knowing in advance what's going to happen is not the same as dooming somebody to a certain destiny. Many things happen without having necessity that they happen. In other words, things can happen that God doesn't have to say for sure that this is what's going to happen. Some things God does say, yes, this is exactly what's going to happen. But with a lot of things, he leaves it up to our choices. So God's foreknowledge of what will happen imposes no necessity on those things requiring them to occur. We still have some free will. We still have free will to be able to make the choices that will either lead to them or not. Things are known not according to how they are knowable, but according to the ability of the knower. This is an important idea. So we're going to get into that thought right there. Things are known. In other words, we don't know things based on so much on science, but on the ability of ourselves to perceive things about other things. All right, and we have different abilities to perceive than God does, and that's what he's going to get into next. So he gives an example of the sphere and the ability of people to perceive a sphere on page 161. Things that are known are not comprehended according to how knowable they are by nature, but rather according to the ability to know of those who are doing the knowing. Take, for instance, a sphere, which is recognizable both by sight and by touch. The one who sees it can be at a distance, and he sees it all at once by the rays of light that pass from the eye. The one who touches it has to come close, grasp it, and sense its roundness piece by piece. In the same way, man is perceived in different ways, by sense perception, imagination, reason, and intuitive intellect. The senses perceive his shape as made up of matter, while imagination considers his shape without paying attention to matter. Reason then transcends imagination, and with a universal consideration looks at the specific form itself of each individual. That was from page 161. So reason as a way of knowing. So only men can reason. Animals can't reason. They can imagine, and they can use their senses to perceive things, but they can't reason. And so reason, when it looks at something, grasps the imaginable and the sensible aspect of the thing. The ability to know or not to know something has more to do with the abilities of the person knowing than on the difficulty of understanding a thing. So there's a poem at the end of that chapter, chapter 4, on page 163 to 164, which talks about how the mind knows things by recognizing forms that are already within the mind. So, and this goes back to one of Plato's ideas that there's forms in the mind of all the things that we perceive on earth, and those are forms of things that are in heaven. Chapter 5. Spiritual beings know things differently than corporeal beings. So there's two basic different types of beings in the world. There's spiritual beings, and there's physical or corporeal beings. So angels would be the perfect example, or God would be the perfect example of spiritual beings, and animals would be the perfect example of corporeal or bodily beings. And man kind of stands in the middle between the two. He's both spiritual and corporeal. So she gives the example at this point. Actually, she says that there's 4 different levels of perception that creatures can have. The first and the lowest is sense perception, which the lower animals have. And she says, like, for instance, that clams and oysters have sense perception. They can sense things, they can hold on to the rocks maybe, but they can't do a whole lot of thinking beyond just sensing things and feeling where they're at. And then the second level up is imagination. And this is in higher animals. Imagination is where they can think about things and imagine what might happen if they were to take certain actions. And so it's a little higher level of thinking, but this is seen in higher animals. Now, obviously, humans have both of these things also. And then the third level of perception is reason, which is only humans have it. Lower animals don't have it. So reason is the ability of the power of the mind to be able to think, understand things, and form judgments about them. Only humans can do this. Animals are unable to do this in the same way. And then finally, there is the final and highest level of perception is intuitive intellect. And only God has this level of perception. And so you might think about how if animals who have only sense perception or an imagination were to watch humans, say a dog watching a human doing a certain process, like reading a book or working with machinery or producing something out of various materials, they would look at it, but they wouldn't be able to understand what the human was doing it or why they were doing it, and this is because of the lack of the reason. And in the same way, when we look at God and we think about the mind of God, we have these 3 lower levels of perception: sense, imagination, and reason. We don't have intuitive intellect, and so when we look at God doing things and we see how He progresses, it sometimes won't make sense to us because we don't have the level of perception that He has, which is intuitive intellect. Each one of these levels sees more deeply than the others, but they don't always seem to line up with each other. For instance, reason might contradict sense and imagination, and this can lead to confusion. But Boethius reassures us that reason would be more reliable than sense and imagination in that situation. At the end of that chapter, the end of chapter 5, there's a poem about how our bodies and the posture that we have, the upright stance that we have, show that we are different from other animals. But man can be spiritual as well as animalistic. We have tendencies that go both ways, tendencies that take us higher towards God and make us more spiritual, tendencies that take us more towards the earth and towards sin and evil and make us more corporeal. And so we have to make decisions. We have to use our free will to take us in one of those directions. Chapter 6. Things are not known according to their nature, but according to the nature of the one who is comprehending them. So this is a theme that keeps coming up throughout this book. And this is to explain the original question about how God can know everything that's going to happen, and yet we still have free will to be able to make our own choices. So God is eternal, which is different from us. God is eternal, which means that his way of looking at things is totally different than us, since we are temporal. So eternal means that he always existed. He existed before the beginning of the world. He will exist long after the end of the world. We are temporal, which means that, and he exists in eternity. To him, the time is not the year 2024. To him, he sees all time as an eternal moment. We are temporal. We see it as the year 2024, and we are living in that year, and we know what happened before that, but we don't know what's going to happen after that. And then he says that Plato was wrong to say that the world had no beginning or end and was co-eternal with God. God perceives all of time in one simultaneous present moment. So the constant changing of things that happens throughout time, for instance, you have different people come to power, different nations rise and fall. Things are constantly changing throughout the history of the world and will continue to change in the future. The constant changing of things caused by time is an imitation of eternity. It seems like it goes on forever, but it is not the same as God's perception of all time as one present moment. So then she says that we agree with Plato when he says that God is eternal, but the world is perpetual. It goes on, but it's not eternal. It doesn't see everything in one moment. It doesn't see it all at once the way God does. God sees all time in one present moment of eternity. So God's foreknowledge, the fact that he knows things in advance, is not a prevision. He doesn't see them before they happen, but providence, because from that high vantage point, he sees at once all things that were and are to come. This is on page 171. We, on the other hand, see things in the temporal present. We only see what's going on right now, here in 2024. He sees things in the eternal present, where he can see all of time in one eternal moment. He doesn't change the nature of things or force fated results on things, but rather he sees all time as if it were happening at once, and that's how he knows all things. Not that he necessarily controls what decisions individual people will make. He doesn't. He allows them free will, but he knows the decisions they'll make because he sees all of time at once. It's not there is no future for God, and there's no past. All things happen in one eternal moment for him. So he gives the example of seeing a man walking and the sun rising at the same time, and understanding that one of them is willed. The man doesn't have to walk, but he's decided to walk. And the other is necessary. The sun must rise and must set. So God can see as present future events that happen as a result of free will. He sees them happening in the present moment of eternity. They are, from God's point of view, necessary because they are going to happen, although they themselves do not lose the freedom that is in their nature. That's on page 173. So they still have free will, and yes, they are going to happen, but it's not because God's forcing them. It's because he sees all time as if it's already happened. In the same way that we can look back on our memory and know what happened with certainty of the past. So he sees the past and the future all in that same way, in the eternal moment. Even if a man were to try to frustrate divine providence, she says, by deciding to do something else than what he had already decided, God would have already foreseen that change, of course. Okay, so he, even if somebody said, well, I'm going to totally change the course of my life and do something totally different, and that will frustrate divine providence. He won't be able to know then what I'm going to do. I can change at any time. Well, God, of course, already sees that change because he sees all of time in one instant. So nothing in the future would surprise him. even a total change of course by a person, which does happen. God sees all from the eternal present. He rewards the good and punishes the wicked. Our prayers are not in vain and are effective. The book ends with, "Do not be deceived. It is required of you that you do good, and that you remember that you live in the constant sight of a judge who sees all things." So there's this theme of eternity in the book, which is extremely important. The reason for Boethius's depression at the very beginning of the book, you might remember when Lady Philosophy asks him, "What is a man?" And he says, "A man is a two-legged animal that is rational." And she says, "Yes, but is he anything more than that?" And he says, "No, I don't think so." And from that, she's able to deduce that he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand who he is, the fact that the soul is eternal, and from further conversation, she also understands what is his destination in life. What is life for? What is the meaning of life? The meaning of life is to strive towards being with God eternally, right? And when you see things that way, it makes sense of all these things that Boethius has been had a hard time figuring out in life. Is, for instance, why do the wicked prosper while the good are persecuted? Well, in the long run, that never happens, right? In the long run, the wicked end up in hell for all eternity, and the good end up in heaven for all eternity. And so there is no disconnect between the way they live their lives and their rewards or punishments. And when you see life that way, when you see life as part of eternity and not just this temporal life, it will solve a lot of the problems that people have looking at things and saying, well, why would a good God allow these bad things to happen? Well, in the end, God makes sure that everything is, that justice is done to everyone, whether it be punishments or rewards. So at the beginning of the book, he fails to recognize that the soul lives forever, not just for this life in heaven or hell, and that there are rewards or punishments. So the reason that God can foresee all things without controlling them has to do with that same thing with eternity, is that he looks at things from the eternal moment, unlike us who looks at things from the temporal moment. So I think that Boethius's point in writing this book is that understanding the nature of eternity will help us to better understand life in general and understand that God is just, that God is in control of the world, and that even when things seem to be going completely in the wrong direction in your life or in the life of the world, God is in control, and rewards and punishments will be dispersed to people according to what they deserve eternally. It's important to remember, because if we just look at it as this life only, it's like, well, there's some people in this life that get away with a lot of bad stuff and they never get punished, right? Well, but the reality is, if we know about eternity, we know that they do get punished, and that hell is 100 times, 1,000 million times worse than any punishment they could have received on this earth. And the same is true for heaven. It's a million times better reward than any reward we could have received on earth. And so there is no injustice. The wicked get away with nothing, and the good never go unrewarded, if we understand that there is eternal life in heaven or in hell.